What's up, everybody? Greetings and salutations. I'm E. Spencer Kite, your friendly neighborhood Spencer man, back after a little hiatus, after a week away, with another edition of One Question for Every Fight as we head into UFC Orlando on Saturday at Amway Center, home of the Magic. And I'm going to get right into it because this is not only a 15-fight card, so there's a lot to get through, but a terrific card. This will be the first of many times you hear me say this over the next couple of days of content, whether it be my own or the preview that I tape with Ian and Harry at some point here during the week. And maybe Sean will jump in. I hope Sean jumps in. He hasn't jumped in on one in a while. This is a great card. We talk all the time about the disappointing cards. And the last time we convened with the UFC, we had a disappointing card. We lost the main event during the course of the event. It wasn't a particularly exciting event. There wasn't a lot of jeopardy at stake in those fights. But this weekend, from top to bottom, from opener to headliner, it is a really great card. Many of the fights carry legitimate divisional ramifications. There are a bunch of top 10 pairings. There are a bunch of really intriguing fights. And so we're going to dive right in with the main event. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson taking on Kevin Holland. And my question here is, where is Wonderboy at right now? So, as always, I preface any comment on age or mention of age with the fact that I am 44. So I've got 4 years and change on Stephen Thompson, who turns 40 in February. Doesn't look a day over 32. That good-looking bastard. But he comes into this fight on a 2-fight losing streak, where those losses are to Gilbert Burns and Belal Muhammad in fights where they deployed the perfect strategy, the correct strategy for defeating Stephen Thompson. Closed the distance, wrestled some more. And so you start to wonder, with those two things combined, 2 losses, turning 40 early next year, are we starting to see a decline of Stephen Thompson? Is this the start of his sort of slide from the top 10? Because traditionally speaking, guys with his level of experience, guys at his age, aren't going to be sticking around in the top 10 at welterweight, especially sort of below light heavyweight. You don't generally see it. And so it feels like a safe initial assumption or a safe initial question of whether we're starting to see the slide of Wonderboy. The interesting sort of counterweight to that is that it was just 2 years ago that he closed out the year with a unanimous decision win over Jeff Neal, who has subsequently come back, get healthy, get some good wins, beat Vicente Luque last time out, and is back in the top 10. And so, and before that, Stephen Thompson beat Vicente Luque at Madison Square Garden. So it sort of feels like there's just a bunch of questions surrounding Stephen Thompson at this point. And this, to me, feels like a good fight. It's not against necessarily a guy that is just expected to come out and wrestle him, as we saw with Belal Muhammad and Gilbert Burns, and in Kevin Holland, a guy that could wrestle, can wrestle, has a jiu-jitsu black belt, but prefers to sort of mix things up and primarily be on the feet. So stylistically, this feels like it could be a reasonable, a winnable matchup for Stephen Thompson. And I'm so curious to see where he's at, because I think we sort of lose sight of how good Stephen Thompson is at times, right? Myself included. And I'm somebody that has covered his entire UFC career, covered him before he was actually in the UFC, I should say, excuse me. I think we sort of lose sight of how good he is and how good he can be in the right circumstances. Now, I think it's safe to say that he is a specialist and he is a guy that needs the right matchup in order to show all of those skills. If he's in there with another wrestler, we're not getting to see the Wonderboy skills. But this fight is one where if Kevin Holland doesn't come out and wrestle, we're going to see the Wonderboy that we're used to. We're going to see the Wonderboy stuff. We're going to see him throwing a whole bunch of side kicks, and we're going to see some spinning kicks, and we're going to see the bouncing and the range and all of those things that make him great and dangerous. And we're going to find out if he's still great and dangerous, because I genuinely don't know. The fact that he's been out for a year, he's laid pretty low in terms of media, right? He's out doing social media stuff, and go follow his Instagram if you don't. He does some great tutorials, does some great instructional videos on how to throw different kicks and do different things. But we haven't heard a lot from Wonderboy. He hasn't been out saying like, hey, look, this is what's going on. This is where I'm at. I'm thinking about retiring, any of those things. I saw earlier today, he was on with the Submission Radio guys talking about future matchups and fights that he would like. So that gives me reason to believe there is more coming from Stephen Thompson. This isn't going to be a farewell. This isn't an end or anything like that. And so I just want to get a better sense of where he fits in this division, because if he is active and still the guy that just 2 years ago beat Jeff Neal, or 3 years ago beat Vicente Luque, that's a really interesting figure in the middle of the top 10 at welterweight that has some guys coming up, that has some veterans sliding back, that has a nice mix of potential opponents for him. But if he is slipping, does he slip more, or can he rebound? Kevin Holland feels like a guy that could be both a terrible matchup for him and a great matchup for him. The same way Stephen Thompson feels like he could be a terrible matchup or a great matchup for Kevin Holland, depending on what Kevin Holland we get. And so this is just one of those intriguing fights to me. I love that it's a main event. I love that it's 5 rounds. We're going to get to see some stuff, and I think we're going to get answers to these questions, or to this question, I should say, on Saturday night. Co-main event stays in the welterweight division. Bryan Barberena versus Rafael Dos Anjos. My question, is can Bam Bam keep rolling? Comes into this fight on a 3-fight winning streak. 2 victories this year. 1 in Matt Brown's backyard in Columbus, Ohio by split decision. The other, most recently, in Las Vegas in July against former champion Robbie Lawler, where he became one of a select number of people to stop Robbie Lawler. Now, as Brian and I talked about for a piece that is up on the UFC website right now, there are certainly people that will say, yeah, but those guys are tail end of their career and you're getting them on the back end of things. And so let's diminish those victories. And I can understand the argument. He understands the argument. But what I will also say is there's a lot of guys that will go in there with Matt Brown or Robbie Lawler and not get their hand raised, and certainly not finish Robbie Lawler. And so if you want to take away from him, you want to detract from those performances, fine, but acknowledge the victories and give him the benefit of the doubt, at least going into this one, because he's won 3 straight since that first return post-surgery loss to Jason Witt. He is a guy that historically has been a tough out and a game competitor, no matter the division, no matter the opponent. And so he comes into this one against RDA, who has been sort of bouncing back and forth between weight classes and divisions. Now makes a second straight returns to welterweight after making a start and a half, essentially, at lightweight, right? The Moicano is not quite a full start because it's a catchweight. Then goes back down, fights Fiziev. That's what he's coming off of. It's another guy that, if you want to make the argument and say, hey, he's catching all of these guys at the tail end, you could probably make that argument for Rafael Dos Anjos, but he just went 4 good rounds against Rafael Fiziev and beat Money Moicano before that in convincing fashion. So I don't think it's fair to say that this guy's slowing down and no longer competitive or any of those things, even though he's 38. And so I'm just really interested to see if, after a number of years in this game, after dealing with that dealing with a life-threatening medical situation that gave him some new perspective, that prompted him to make some changes, especially this year in terms of the way he executes his training camps, is Bryan Barberena just sort of tapping into a late career, later than you expect little surge, where he's going to be able to keep this going. He is a considerable underdog in this fight for somebody that's coming off a stoppage win over Robbie Lawler. We'll cover that on Friday when we get to picks and plays. Spoiler alert, or foreshadowing, I guess you could say. But this just feels like a spot where, if he has really and truly tapped into something and is putting all the pieces together that I talk about all the time, right? Not everybody hits their prime hits the peak of their powers at the same point. Some do it young, some do it kind of late 20s, early 30s, some do it later. Bam's in that 32, 33 range. Like, this isn't a dude that's, 37, 38. This is right the tail end of his athletic prime. And if you take away the fact, or if you factor in that he had a year there where he was sidelined after back surgery, he had 8-9 months there where he was laid up following the surgery to repair the ruptured omentum in his stomach. It's funny that I still remember omentum. This is a guy that is still just kind of like, you can understand why now is when he's starting to put it together. And I'm just super fascinated to see how this one plays out, because Dos Anjos is a guy that, like, he's a truth machine, right? If you're good, it's going to take a lot to beat him. And if you're good and you can beat him, that tells us something. It carries a bunch of weight. And if you're not, if this is Bryan Barberena catching guys at the right time towards the end of their career, RDA will show that on Saturday. Standing in the cage with a guy that has been lightweight champion and fought for the interim welterweight title will show you that you're not ready or not capable of hanging at this level. And so this is a very meaningful fight. This is a big fight for, really, truly, in my opinion, both of these guys, because I know that RDA wants to make another run. He's not satisfied just being a gatekeeper and just hanging out facing guys like Bam Bam. And so this is a fascinating fight, and I can't wait to see what happens. Move to the flyweight division. Matheus Nicolau and Matt Schnell. My question is, why is no one talking about this fight? Good Lord, this is a great fight. Top 10 flyweights, division's on fire. Nicolau is 6-1 in the UFC. And look, I get that there have been some questionable decisions in there, both first tour and second tour in the UFC. I get that he's not always the most aggressive fighter in the UFC. He picks his spots. He's very selective, very methodical and tactical. But last time out against David Dvorak, he looked great. Turned up the pressure a little bit, turned up the output a little bit, and put it on the Undertaker. Hurt him a couple times and early, and just never let off the gas. And he's facing the Terminator. He's facing the T-1000. Matt Schnell in his last fight was that fight against Sumerdarji, where all of us sat there watching it going, how is this dude not on the canvas? How is this fight not over? What the hell is Matt Schnell made of? And then not only did he survive that hellacious beating, he rallied and got a finish and choked Sumerdarji out. Like, this dude is allergic to being in boring fights. And now he's facing a guy that's 6-1 and stationed just outside the top 5 in this division, that is going to be front and center next year when we close things out with Figueiredo and Moreno part 4. This is the sleeper fight. This is one that should be getting far more attention than it is, because it, not just because it's a top 10 matchup, but because what we know to expect from each of these guys, what we know primarily to expect from Matt Schnell. If you want to say Nicolau is sort of not your cup of tea and a guy that's a little bit passive and a little bit patient, well, Matt Schnell is the guy that doesn't let you be patient. If you want to sit there and not throw, great. He's going to walk you down and punch you in the face and try to just inject chaos into your life. Every Matt Schnell fight is entertaining. I'm a big fan of Matheus Nicolau. I think this is a great fight. I think the winner of this is in the top 5 and facing one of those familiar names near the top, whether that's Alexandre Pantoja at some point, whether that's the winner of the Kai Kara France Alex Perez fight next year. Like, this is a big, meaningful, important fight, and we got to spend more time talking about it because it's terrific. Next up, heavyweights Tai Tuivasa and Sergey Pavlovich. My question is, why is Tuivasa a 2-1 dog here? Like, I get that Pavlovich is rolling. I get that he's looked great since getting thrown into the deep end against Alistair Overeem in his promotional debut in Singapore a bunch of years ago. And he's a big, menacing looking Russian heavyweight. But like, do we not remember that Tai Tuivasa was in Paris going toe to toe with, as Harry would say, Cyril Gagne for 2 full rounds and then part of a third, where, yeah, he lost, but did anybody come away from that fight thinking less of Tai Tuivasa if anything, that fight confirmed to me all the things I thought going into it, that Tai really has turned things around. He really has truly committed himself to his preparations, to his craft, to developing as a competitor. He's still going to be a brawler and a guy that when push comes to shove is going to throw sledgehammers at you. But he's also not going to be a guy that's going to gas in 5 minutes. And he's a guy that can take some shots. And he's a guy that's been in there with very good competition. Not that Pavlovich hasn't, and I don't want to diminish Derek Lewis here. But his best win is that sudden, quick, probably early stoppage last time out against Derek Lewis. It's a good win. It's certainly a good victory. And I think even if the fight goes on, Pavlovich is a style of fighter that is going to beat Derek Lewis 7 times out of 10, 8 times out of 10. But beyond that, it's Shamil Abdurakhimov and then a couple guys that aren't in the UFC anymore, and Marcelo Golm and Maurice Green. Those guys aren't Tai Tuivasa. And now look, Tai hasn't fought superstar competition on the way along this winning streak, right? Since he returned from a 1-year hiatus. But he's beat some good fighters. He's beat Augusto Sakai. He's beat Derek in a fashion that it wasn't questionable. There was no like, I don't know if that's Tai Tuivasa's win over Derek Lewis. To set up that fight with Ciryl Gane was a convincing, dominant, clear performance from Bam Bam. And so just feels like one fight removed and a good performance and a good fight at that removed from being the main event on the first show in Paris, France. And now he's a dog to Sergey Pavlovich. Maybe bookmark that one for Friday as well. Middleweights, Jack Hermansson against Roman Dolidze. My question here is, will Dolidze make the most of this short notice opportunity and continue his run of success? I am, generally speaking, not a fan of guys taking short notice fights. I think I understand them all the time. Understand them, right? You're the guy trying to get into the UFC. You want a foot in the door, short notice, great way to go. You're fully confident in your own skills, abilities, think you could beat a ranked fighter, whatever. Great, I understand it. This one to me is that sweet spot to me where it makes sense, and I want to see people take these opportunities. So Dolidze's on a 2-fight winning streak, and he gets the opportunity to jump in for Derek Brunson here against the top 10 fighter in the Joker, where if he wins, winning streak suddenly becomes, he's on a 3-fight winning streak already, back-to-back knockouts is what I meant to say. So if he gets a victory on Saturday, 3-fight winning streak becomes 4, becomes a 3rd straight win this year, and puts him into the top 10, quickly elevates him just a couple weeks after beating Phil Hawes into that conversation in the sort of 3 through 6 range in the division, 3 through 8 range in the division. If he loses, then he loses on short notice to Jack Hermansson, who is sort of the Neil Magny of the middleweight division, right? A guy that if you are a contender, you're probably going to beat him. And if you're not quite there, as we saw with Chris Curtis last time out, then you're probably not going to get there. And you're probably not going to beat him. And so this is a chance for Dolidze to show really where he fits in this division. And maybe just because of the difference of styles and the different elements he brings to the cage that Derek Brunson doesn't have, a chance to sneak one by Jack Hermansson that gets him moving forward and gives him even more momentum going into next year. He's already had a great year. He's already truly solidified himself in the middleweight division as a guy to keep an eye on. How this one plays out will dictate how we talk about him to start next year. He's already going to be on my fighters to watch for 2023 for the middleweight division, because I think what he's done against Kyle Daukaus and Phil Hawes in his last 2 shows me some things that I'm interested in. I'm not going to put too much weight in this if he does lose, because it is short notice. It is the quick turnaround. But I tell you what, if he goes out and wins, it ups that status even more. Sticking in the division, and speaking of Kyle Daukaus, he returns here for the first time since facing Dolidze to face Eric Anders. My question is, will Daukaus ever become a consistent middleweight? He is someone that I have had a great deal of hope for, a great deal of interest in, since he was on the Contender Series several years ago when he was undefeated as the CFFC middleweight champ. Got a win that day, didn't get a contract, but made his appearance soon after, where he lost to Brendan Allen in his debut. He's never had consecutive results in the UFC. It's been a loss, a win, a loss, a no contest, a win, and then a loss, if I can remember that correctly off the top of my head. So 2-3 and a no contest. The no contest against the headliner, Kevin Holland. The last loss against Dolidze, where he got his face broken. Got his face broken. He's got 2 plates in his face now and like mesh holding his, molded to his eye that holds his eye sort of in place. He's one. I'm going to do 10 things I like. And look, Kyle Daukaus is going to be on there as a fighter I can't quit. I may not have to do fighter I can't quit, but if I did, Kyle Daukaus would be in there as a fighter I can't quit, because there's just something about this dude at 29 that feels like we just haven't seen the best. And for whatever reason, things haven't clicked yet. And I don't know if that's slow starts. I don't know if that's just facing superior competition with the guys that have beaten him, because I don't think he's lost to anybody that I sort of downplay or I discredit. I think Brendan Allen's a good fighter. I think that Roman Dolidze is a good fighter. I can't remember who the third person is right now, and that kills me because I should. But he feels like somebody, and I've talked about this a lot on this program in particular, feels like somebody that is just 1 or 2 steady performances away from unlocking something and really going on a run. Middleweight is always wide open, especially in that middle of the pack where you can have a bit of a run and you can make some strides before you get into facing the Jack Hermansons of the world. He's run into tough competition. He's beaten the guys that he should beat. It's unfortunate that the fight with Kevin Holland a year and change ago now, went the way it did with the clash of heads, because that was a very winnable fight, and that would have changed the way we think about Kyle Daukaus. It would have changed where he was at divisionally as well. And so I just want to see, like, can he go out on Saturday, get a good win over Eric Anders, and start building? We talked before this fight, and I asked him about that. Like, is it tough that you've had this start-stop with everything, and big injuries or long layoffs or different things and fights falling out and this or that and the other? And he says all the right things, and he said all of the right things about, I can't let any of that stuff bother me. I have to just look at it like I'm 0-0, and all I need to do is on December 4th, I need to be 1-0 because I beat Eric Anders. And that's great. But from a true momentum and build standpoint, he needs to get a good result. He needs to get a couple good results. It needs to be 1 or 2 or 3 steady performances, because I truly believe that those things carry over. Each time you get a good performance, you build on that performance. Each time you suffer a setback, you make adjustments and you build off that performance and you regroup off that performance. I hope to see Kyle Daukaus regroup and rebuild this weekend. And I'm really interested to see if he can put this together at some point and become a consistent fighter in this division, because I think he's got the talent. We just got to see it. We move back to the welterweight division. Nico Price returns after a little over a year away to take on the Fresh Prince, Phil Rowe. And my question is Phil Rowe for real? So, lost his promotional debut coming off of the Contender Series to Gabriel Green. Follows that up with a second round stoppage win over Orion Cosce, and then follows that up with a second round stoppage win over Jason Witt. I don't know what to make of Phil Rowe right now, because, and I say this with all due respect, the guys he beat are guys he should beat. Orion Cosce isn't a UFC caliber fighter. Jason Witt is a veteran that is perfectly suited for being in the lower third of the welterweight division. He is going to make you pay if you make mistakes. And if you are not UFC caliber, he will beat you. And if he gets the right matchup and you want to just bang it out with him, he can beat you. But when you fight wisely and smartly and strategically behind your very long jab, as Phil Rowe did last time out, he's going to beat you. You're going to, that's not a fight Jason Witt is going to win. But I just don't know, right? Like 3 fights to me isn't enough of a sample size, and the level of competition in those 3 fights isn't enough of a sample size for me to make a real, truly informed decision on Phil Rowe. But this is a fight that's going to allow me to do that because we know Niko Price. We know what this guy brings to the table. We know where he fits in the division. We know what it means to beat him. We know what it takes to beat him. These are the fights that I crave for guys like Phil Rowe, because this is truly when you get answers. This is how you get answers. Him going out and facing another guy in that Kosi Jason Witt sort of mold doesn't do anything. He probably wins that fight, and he's on a 3-fight winning streak that looks lovely, but doesn't prove anything, doesn't really truly show us or teach us anything. Those fights don't inform me of anything. But how he does against Niko Price, a noted finisher, a guy that has fought top 15 competition or just outside of it, lives in that second 15, that's going to tell me something. You beat this guy, I know something about you. I know what that means. And if you lose, I fully understand what that means as well. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't get there, but it means you need more work. And this is why I have a show called One Question for Every Fight, right? I want to know. This is what I want to know for this fight. And just generally speaking, where do these people fit? Is Phil Rowe someone I need to pay greater attention to? Someone I need to reformulate an opinion about or deepen my opinion on? Or is he just somebody that's beaten a couple guys that he should have beaten? We're going to find out on Saturday. Move to the strawweight division, Angela Hill versus Emily Ducote. My question is, can Ducote defeat a podcast pairing? Last time out in her promotional debut, she defeated Jessica Penne, who hosts the Two Straws podcast with Angela Hill. I love this matchup. I don't know if Mick Maynard knows that Angela Hill and Jessica Penne host a podcast. I believe he would. I don't know how this fight came together, whether either side of this bout put forward the names and said, hey, this is who I want to fight. I like to think that Angela Hill called up Mick Maynard and was like, hey, I want that girl that beat my podcast, beat my best friend, beat my podcast partner. Let's make it happen. Great. I love this fight. Much like beating Penne tells us something about where Emily Ducote fits right out of the chute in the UFC, beating Angela Hill will as well, if she's able to do it. I don't say that as like she's going to go out and do it, but like if she's able to beat Angela Hill, we know what that means. And say what you want about Angie Hill being 9-12 in the UFC, which, yes, is not a good record. There's 2 or 3 fights in there that are split decisions that probably could have went the other way. So that certainly changes things. And there's no shame in losing to some of the people she's lost to, right? She got thrown in with Tisha Torres and Rose Namajunas back to back in her second and third UFC appearances after she had 2 fights in mixed martial arts coming off the Ultimate Fighter. She won her debut against Emily Kagan, and then it was Tisha, and then it was Rose Namajunas in Texas. That didn't go well, and she got bumped. She got released. She went to Invicta. She started to grow. She started to learn. She won the belt there. She returned, but like it's been a tough slate. Her return fight was Jessica Andrade. She's fought everybody that's everybody in this division, save for like the absolute apex talent, save for that pack that has been, passing the title around for the last bunch of years. She's in there with Claudia Gadelha. She was in there with Michelle Watterson. She's been in there with just really good competition. And so 9-12 isn't a great record, but she's one of those fighters that like her skill and her ability and her talents extend far beyond what the record conveys. And so this, again, much like the fight with Penne, is going to tell us a great number of things about where Emily Ducote fits. They are both former Invicta champions. I love that element of this fight as well. I think Ducote has a chance to be a real factor in this division going forward. This is that next step. This is that next test. We talk about it all the time. Harry and I talk about it all the time. We talk about it on the preview show all the time. What you want to see, or what you should want to see from athletes like Ducote and from athletes in general, is just the next test, the next step forward to give us more information, to allow us to change our projections of where the ceiling is and where the floor is and how to figure these things out and draw sort of ideas and forecasts and projections for where these competitors could end up. We know who Angela Hill is. Saturday is going to tell us a lot more about who Emily Ducote is and where she fits in the 115-pound weight class. Lightweight division, Clay Guida versus Scott Hot Sauce Holtzman. My question is, when, if ever, will Clay Guida slow down? My guy turns 41 a couple days after this event. He is still the Energizer Bunny of the UFC. He is still the guy that walks out every fight, singing along, bopping along to whatever his walkout track is that week, that fight. Still gets slapped up by his big brother Jason before every fight. Still lets out crazy, ridiculous burps every time he gets back to his corner. And despite coming off a loss in his last fight, still been doing relatively well in the UFC overall, right? Like, had that rally to beat Leo Santos prior to his fight with Claudio Puelles. And so, like, I know a lot of people will say, like, 40 and 12 losses in the UFC. One of, I believe, 4 fighters on this card that has 12 losses in the UFC. Shouts to Andy Hickey for putting that on Twitter. But, like, dude's still here. Dude's still doing well, reasonably speaking. He's another one of these veterans that has understood I need to take a little bit of a step back. I can't be facing the absolute best of the division, but give me the guys in my age bracket, give me the guys in my talent range, and we can still have some fun fights. This is one of those bouts where I can see Clay Guida going out and looking great and just coming away again, asking this same question on Saturday. When the Christ is this dude going to slow down? When is he going to stop being able to just wrestle guys into oblivion and continue having success in the UFC? You're not supposed to do it at 40. Not in this division where it's full of killers. And now this matchup, to be fair, Scott Holtzman, a little bit older as well, I believe in his late 30s, maybe even veering towards 40. But like, Clay Guida's been around since Christ was a cowboy. Like, if this dude goes out and when's he ever going to slow down? When? I would not be surprised if Clay Guida does the, like, I'm going to fight till I'm 45 thing. I'm going to try to fight till I'm 50 and manages to just keep hanging around, trading wins and losses and being able to do it, because the guy seems to have boundless energy and it's inspiring. It's fun to watch. I can't wait to see how this fight plays out. Maybe he starts slowing down this weekend. Who knows? I want to find out, though. We stick in the lightweight division. Michael Johnson versus Mark Diakiese. My question is, can Diakiese be a lightweight dark horse in 2023? This year, he made some smart strategic decisions against Vyacheslav Borshev and Damir Hadzovic. He wrestled. He went back to his wrestling that we talked about on the preview show prior to both fights. He has always had. Some people seem to have forgotten that Mark Diakiese can wrestle because the highlights have been the Street Fighter knockout of Timu Pakalin and some of the crazy, striking battles he's engaged in. But he made good decisions and decided, I need to wrestle to get these wins, to stop the bleeding of this losing streak, course correct a little bit, get myself moving in the right direction. That mission is accomplished. He's now won 2 straight. He's on a new contract. That started last fight against Hadzovic. Mark Diakiese's still only 29. It feels like he's been around forever, and so you assume He's 33 or 34, maybe even older. He's 29. And so is it possible that after a hot start, a rough stretch, and resetting, Bone Crusher can start putting together something here and build off these two smart wins, pick up a third victory against Michael Johnson, who has fought a hellacious strength of schedule over the course of his career and still counts as a that one means something kind of victory, to set himself up going into next year as a guy that's 29, has reminded us he can wrestle, has shown us in the past that he has nasty striking, and still has a little bit of room to grow and can still continue to work with the crews that he works with and build out some stuff and keep getting better now that he's sort of matured a little as a man and in his understanding of himself and his place and the things he needs to do to be successful inside the octagon. That's the big takeaway from earlier this year. Could he have gone out and gotten into a brawl with Slava Borchev? Of course. Would have been a much closer fight. So he did the right things. It's interesting to see what happens now that he's shown, hey, if I need to, I could just go to a double leg. If I need to, I can go to chain wrestling. I can grapple. So now you got to be wary of that. Now I can start throwing my hands more. And a guy like that at 29, again, at 29, it's really interesting in a division where there's always opportunities. Is Mark Jacasey a guy that's just going to sneak up on some people next year? We'll see. We'll see through Saturday. Saturday will tell us a little bit more about that. Move to featherweight, Darren Elkins versus Jonathan JSP Pierce. Question here is, has anyone ever done more with less than Darren Elkins? And look, I say that with all the respect possible for Darren Elkins. This is not a like, how did this guy get here? Anything like that. Like, this is a Darren Elkins appreciation statement because he is as blue collar, as workmanlike, as meat and potatoes as they come. But my guy is 17-9 in the UFC. And up until that 4-fight stretch, capped with the loss to Nate Landwehr, it was only good fighters that beat Darren Elkins. Like, you go back and look at that resume, you'd be surprised how many wins, how many victories, how many good performances there were, and who it took in order to beat him. It was Charles Oliveira early. There was a Chad Mendes in there. There was a Ricardo Lamas in there. There might have been a Hakron Diaz. Like, good fighters, ranked fighters. And through it all, Darren Elkins has just kept grinding. And he's rallied from some bad spots and fights that look like sure losses to pull these things out. And like, he's not a guy that you look at, even when he's doing it, right? For the longest time, it sort of just felt like this was, how does this keep happening? How does this guy keep winning? He's just wrestling, and his superpower is that he can take a hellacious beating. That's not a good recipe for success overall in the UFC. But it turns out, when you cannot be grinded down, when you can't be worn out, when you can take a hellacious beating and still keep coming, you're going to have success. And Darren Elkins has had a tremendous amount of success. Say what you will about never getting into the top 10, never fighting for a title, any of those things. Darren Elkins has 17 wins in the UFC. He's been fighting in the UFC for a decade. When this dude started, there was no one that thought this guy's going to be around for a decade and he's going to put up double-digit wins and he's going to be a perennially tough out and he's going to be this indefatigable fighter that is just a pain in the ass for everyone that shares the cage with him. That's who he's become. I love this matchup with Jonathan Pierce because Pierce is one of those guys that, as good as he is and as good as he's been since transitioning back to featherweight, 4 wins, 3 finishes, looked really good in his last fight against Makwan Amirkhani. He's a guy that'll tire. And you don't want to be the guy that will tire facing Darren Elkins, because that dude will keep coming. And if you are tired, he is going to suffocate you. Can't wait to see this fight. Like I said off the top, fantastic card. Let's go. I was going to say move to strawweight. We don't. We move to flyweight. Tracy Cortez versus Amanda Ribas. Question here is, where do the ceilings rest for these two? Genuinely curious. Don't have a good read. Think I have an idea for each, but this fight is going to show me whether I'm biased or not, truthfully, honestly. So I've never been a big Tracy Cortez fan. And not in a like hater kind of way. There's not a lot to her game in my estimation. She's a good wrestler. Give it to her. Good wrestler. Decent hands. Haven't seen that progression and evolution through her UFC fights that I would like to see from a 20-something at a great camp like Fight Ready with that good wrestling base, right? That feels like a great starting point. So let me see the hands get better. Let me see the conditioning get better. Let me see even the work on the ground, the grappling on the ground get better. If you could put people on the canvas, great. But what can you do beyond just keep them there? So I've never really been sold on Cortez. But look, 10 straight wins. Unbeaten in the UFC. Like at some point, even dudes like me got to give it up. I say it all the time. You don't win consecutive fights like this without being good. So she's clearly good. How good? I don't know. Conversely, Amanda Ribas is somebody that I've always been really high on, that I've always estimated as being a future contender. But I don't know if that's the case. I base that off beating Mackenzie Dern in her second fight and some good showings along the way. I put a lot of stock in that performance against Verna Jandiroba a couple fights ago. I like what she did against Caitlin Chukagian in a weird sort of hastily put together, I'll go up to flyweight, I want to stay busy. Michelle Watterson keeps backing out of fights because she's injured. Let's just go and do it. But she's also lost to the best competition she's faced in the UFC, which is a thing I pay attention to, as you know, in losing to Chukagian and Marina Rodriguez at the start of 2021. And so this is one of those fights where no matter how it plays out, no matter who wins, who loses, we are going to learn a great deal about each of these competitors, because stylistically, this is an interesting fight as well. Cortez with the wrestling. Amanda Ribas is a judoka and a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt as well. She likes to throw hands a bit more, but isn't great at it. It's coming along. But what can she do off her back? What can, if Tracy Cortez puts her down, does she have an active guard? Does she have a quick get up game? Or is she content to just be there on bottom, not really doing much? We're going to find out. And look, this division is loaded right now with young talent, right? We talked about that 4-pack that's coming up. Erin Blanchfield, Macy Barber, Miranda Maverick, Casey O'Neill, all of them are up there. We've got others that are coming. There are more that are coming, right? Natalia Silva just had another great performance 2 weeks ago. She's coming. And I think the winner of this is very much, and maybe the loser as well, because look, maybe these are both top 5 fighters. So I don't want to say that one goes forward and the other cannot. Maybe both of these athletes are top 15 fighters going forward. This is why I want to see this fight. This is why I love these fights. This is what I want from fight cards. And it's what I hope more people want and appreciate and look forward to, not just this weekend, but overall. We are getting answers to questions. We are going to get solid visual proof and visual evidence to base our thoughts on Saturday in this fight. That's all we can ask for. It's great. I love it. Next up, Natan Levy versus Genaro Valdez. My question for these lightweights is, which DWCS alum wins out? So both of these guys, each of these guys, came off the Contender Series. Natan Levy lost his debut to Rafa Garcia. Genaro Valdez lost his debut earlier this year to the steamroller Matt Frivola in a 3-minute and 15-second slobber knocker. And so this really is, this is the fight on the card that fits that Polyana v. Anna Jinhyu Frey mold of, it's still entertaining. It doesn't have a lot of divisional impact, but it's going to be entertaining as shit because Genaro Valdez is incapable of being in a boring fight. And while Natan Levy at times can be too selective and not throw enough, Valdez, like Matt Schnell in the fight with Matoish Nicolau earlier in the night, is just going to be out there dragging him into a dogfight. And so we're going to see. I have been probably pretty douchey about Natan Levy in the past. I used to have the Natan Levy number, which was my calculation of the records of the guys you beat on your way to your shiny undefeated record. I've now subsequently changed it to just refer to it as opponent record calculation or something like that. But like, he's a guy that I wasn't overly impressed with on Contender Series. I wasn't impressed. I wasn't high on him going into that debut against Rafa Garcia. I wasn't even that high on him going into or coming out of the fight with Mike Breeden that he won last time out. So I'm still not sold on this dude. But we're going to see on Saturday if I'm an asshole hater or if my read was kind of right, that he's a guy that has beaten some not great competition to get to where he is. Same thing applies for Genaro Valdez. Like, this fight is a little bit of a referendum on recent Contender Series graduates, which the track record hasn't been great. I'm going to give you a little peek behind the curtain here. Coming in December, when we get that little stretch after the last card of the year before we get into 2023, and do a little something on Contender Series and results and records and things like that, because I watch all of them and I'm super interested in these things. But it hasn't been that great lately. And these two guys fit sort of what has been the challenge and what has been the like tough part to swallow about the Contender Series. So we'll see who moves forward. We'll see who gets a victory, and then we'll go from there. Featherweight, Marcelo Rojo versus Francis Marshall. Question here is whether this is all a bit too soon for Francis Marshall. He's a 23-year-old kid that's 6-0. He too, a graduate of Contender Series earlier this year, where he got a unanimous decision win over Connor Matthews in a good fight, a competitive fight, but one of those fights that, for me watching it, I didn't come away from it thinking, man, we got to get Francis Marshall into the UFC, right? Like, Connor Matthews is a tough sumbitch that took a beating, but that doesn't make me want to see Francis Marshall in the UFC at this point. It makes me impressed that Connor Matthews could take that kind of a beating, but at 6-0 and 23 years old, I'd rather see Francis Marshall get 3, 4, 5 more fights on the regional circuit. Have a busy year in 2023 where you're facing good veterans that have either, perfect time to be facing the guys that get released from the UFC or Bellator or One or wherever, or to go to some place. He's an East Coast guy. He's a Kurt Pellegrino protege. So go to some place like CFFC or Ring of Combat, or even go up to New England and fight at CES or Combat Zone or one of those where you're facing good competition, like tough regional circuit dudes that the records may not be great, but we know how tough they are. We know how good they are and what those wins mean. Because this feels like he could just be walking into facing an absolute pit bull. And that is pun intended, because it is Marcelo Rojo's nickname. But like, this is a dangerous, tough, 34-year-old Argentinian that has had a lot more experience and has been in there with good guys over the course of his last couple of fights and kind of throughout his career. And like, this may just be throwing a 23-year-old that isn't quite ready to swim into the deep end. And this isn't even the deepest end, right? Rojo's 0-2 in the UFC. This isn't the like, oh my God, there's no way he can win this fight. This is way too deep. This is the right matchup for him coming into the UFC. Somebody that's on a losing streak that hasn't had success yet, but it still may be too much. And that too is one of the things we need to sort of investigate and talk about with these Contender Series fighters as they're coming forward. So I'm very interested to see how Marshall acquits himself, how he handles himself on Saturday, how this plays out in terms of results, and what that means in terms of it being too soon for Francis Marshall, potentially. We get to the opener, Yasmin Haragui, Estela Nunes. My question here is just how is Haragui opening this card? So her debut came in August in San Diego, and she was on the main card. And a lot of people, understandably, I will say, were not up in arms, but very, very curious as to why a UFC newcomer facing a fellow newcomer in Yasmin Lucindo were on the main card. The fight card was in San Diego. Haragui is from right across the border in Mexico, trains at Entrim Gym. There's your answer. But now that we shift to the other side of the country and we're in the Panhandle, she goes to the opener. Like, she's another one of these young, talented fighters in a good division. She's undefeated. Let's see what she can do. We just had her on the main card of a fight card that people paid attention to that was on ESPN, as this one is. And yet there's no space for her on the main card or even further up the card, right? Like, I'm not there. All the final 5 fights all should be the way they are. Could you put her in the main card opener instead of Eric Anders and Kyle Dawkins? Abso-goddamn-lutely. Should you? Yeah, probably. If she was on the main card for her debut and she won and she looked good and she's 25 and undefeated and a chance to move forward, yeah, get as many eyeballs on her as possible. Don't stick her on the opener of a 15-fight card where there are certainly going to be people that are like, look, it's 15 fights. I'm going to jump in somewhere around the 6th fight or maybe just the main card because I can't spend 7 hours on Saturday watching UFC events. So I'll skip the first 3 or 4 fights. Then people aren't watching Yasmin Haragui, who looked good in her debut, who should look good on Saturday against Estela Nunes, who hasn't looked great in her 2 UFC fights. Just feels like one of those weird spots, one of those weird decisions. I could be wrong. I could be making the incorrect read here. This could be you know far more than me. Wouldn't be the first time, won't be the last time. But it just feels like an odd placement after she was on the main card in her debut and was successful. But we shall see. That's it for the questions. That's UFC Orlando, top to bottom. It is as I said, terrific card. Super pumped for this card. Cannot wait to see it. Can't wait to dive into the rest of the content this week. We'll be back on Thursday. Today is Wednesday. We'll be back on Thursday with 10 things. We'll be back on Friday with picks and plays. 2 straight winning weeks. Looking forward to coming back and trying to keep that streak rolling. We'll be around for the preview show later this week. Myself, Ian, Harry, maybe Sean. I will be doing the recap work for both the UFC, but also putting out a piece on severemma.com. Following this event, Harry and I will be back with the takeaways next week. We'll be back in regular rotation for the next 3 weeks. So thank you for coming back. Thank you for sticking with us through the break. I hope you enjoyed it as always. If you have thoughts, feedback, comments, concerns, hit me up. You know how to get in touch with me at Spencer Kite on all platforms or just in the comments here. Go sign up for the Patreon. It's almost the start of December. Best time to sign up is the start of the month because you get all of the content, and there is a lot, and it is outstanding for £5. So go sign up. severemma.com/pints. Best URL in the business by far. Go do that. Check out everything the boys are putting out. Check out everything I'm putting out. I appreciate you. I love you. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. And we'll see you next week.